I'll start the recording. Okay. Dear colleagues, my name is Svetlana Stevenson, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's Interdisciplinary Research Forum's event on civic identity, performance, and the city. The interdisciplinary nature of this forum links architecture, art, music, performance, history, anthropology, sociology, and politics all in an hour and a half. So I'm very excited to be able to host this event on behalf of our forum. And today's event has been convened by Professor Christian Frost and Dr. Jacek Skaso at the School of Art, Architecture and Design in our university. Thank you so much, Christian and Jacek, for suggesting and organizing this event. And I will now give the floor to Professor Matthew Berrock to chair today's workshop. Okay, Matthew, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. Welcome from me as well. As Svetlana said, I'm Professor of Architecture and Urban Culture at the School of Art, Architecture and Design, and we are co-hosting this with. We are co-hosting from the Center of Urban and Built Ecologies this event with Creature. I'm representing Cube, the Center for Urban and Built Ecologies, with Christian Jacek Ludwig Skaso presenting Creature. And we also are welcoming external guests today. We have Christian who will start, and I will introduce him briefly now. Thereafter, Jacek will speak with his research colleague, Kirsten Jessica Thompson. And third, Ray Lucas will speak, and I'll introduce each of the speakers in turn as we get to them. Christian is our head of architecture at the School of Art, Architecture and Design. He qualified as an architect in 1990 after completing his studies at the University of Cambridge. He is a practitioner working in the UK and abroad for over 10 years before becoming a full-time academic and researcher. And his history into the foundation of Salisbury resulted in the publication of Time, Space and Order, the Making of Medieval Salisbury in 2009. Since that time, he's published widely in relation to the themes of research into festivals and architecture, particularly in relation to Florence, which was the subject of his PhD. And since 2019, he's held the post of head of architecture. Christian is going to start with a statement about the theme of the event overall, and then go directly into his presentation. So over to you, Christian. If you can speak for around 15 minutes, we'll then move on to the next speaker. Thank you.
This is the introduction, and then my talk afterwards, I think. So it's a little bit longer than 15, but it should be around that. So hopefully you've read the introduction that talks about the relationship between civic, as the city as a body of people, and the city as a group of buildings or as a group of spaces. And I think today what we're going to be talking about is how we research those sorts of things, how we begin to look at those things, and can they ever be really separated? So if we take the idea that the city should be seen as something that is not objectified as a landscape of buildings, but a setting for something ranging from mundane daily task to a place for ritual, then we have to find ways that we can reveal such research. If we add to this the idea that many festivals and rituals have emerged from special cultural traditions that are not only directly inherited, but also to remain valid, are continually renewed. This understanding of the depth of history in the present is often called historicity or historicality, translated from the German Geschichtlichkeit. To research such a phenomenon, we have to find a way of recording or revealing this depth of experience, both as a unique event in the present, as well as something repeated that is different from the events in the past, but linked. This dual aspect is often characterized as the time out of time. It comes with both a temporal and a spatial component. and as you will see in these different presentations, manifests the experience of the event in different degrees of consciousness, i.e., some of the events are built off an understanding and awareness of this depth of phenomenon, and others access it, sometimes unknowingly. And as a consequence, an apparently mundane event can reveal a festive time out of time experience by reason of its particular setting in both time and place, even if one is not consciously constructing it in such a way. Terms to use to reveal this differentiated experience of festival include liminality, term used by Turner and Van Gennep, amongst others, indicating a place or experience that is between two conditions, also often referred to in terms of something like a threshold. But I think liminality is more often used to describe the presence of both spaces simultaneously rather than the threshold between them itself. So it's a simultaneity of experience rather than a boundary. And I'm just going to describe then the way that Victor Turner describes different levels of engagement in performance in the city. And he identifies these three different modes of participation as separation, transition, and incorporation. Firstly, everyone who witnesses the event is separated into a community out of time. And at the other end, the smallest group of the hierarchy, the festival participants who in participating deny their own identity and as a result are deemed to be incorporated. In between these two states rests the remainder of the population who experience what Turner calls transition, a sort of limbo which has a few of the attributes of either the preceding or subsequent profane social statuses or cultural states. Also for Turner, participants in the event form a new community he labelled communitas. And for Turner, this communitas was formed, revealed and shaped by the event itself and was related to a state of being he called, as we've said, liminality, that emerged from a time out of time, which is also characterized by Gadamer as a form of festival time. The problem with such an idea for many social theorists, or particularly Marxist historians, is that such a description removes the protagonists from the normal life, from their normal social structures, which form the basis of their historical or contemporary identity. So, as a critique, this is a critique from Eden Salnow, for Turner, so far from reflecting or reinforcing secular social structure, such an event is a liminal phenomenon which betokens the partial, if not complete, abrogation of that structure and tends towards communitas, a state of unmediated egalitarian association between individuals who are temporarily freed of the hierarchical secular roles and statuses which they bear in everyday life. So you can see that there's a conflict between how you might look at this, and if you look at it in one way, other people will not take that research seriously because you are taking them out of a political situation. So such a negation of the social hierarchy is not considered a valid history in some areas of thought. Perhaps that's something we can discuss later. The other interesting aspect of festival is its ability to simultaneously reveal the counterculture. The counterculture and resist the total imposition of new meanings which do not link to its historicity. So you can't take over a festival totally, and there'll be examples of that maybe come up a bit later. And although many accounts of these types of events, historical or contemporary, don't often describe the architecture, it can be argued that the architecture, the spaces of the city that do much to maintain the continuity of the tradition, the ultimate or foundational reference for the time out of time, even if the activities associated to it or the political conditions that drive it are subject to radical change. After all, it is the very specific location of events from pilgrimage through ritual to festival that link the ontological conditions of the festival to the world from which any detachment occurs. So there is this relationship again between, although architecture is often not described, it's fundamentally significant for the experience. Okay, so So I'm going to now talk about a case study, which is, I'm calling it civitas et urbum, these two relationships of a body of people and a body of buildings, if you like, or body of spaces, understanding the festive city. And I'm just going to take you through very quickly a series of images that describe the ways in which I gathered information on a particular feast day, on the feast of San Giovanni, which is the founding saint of Florence, which is held on the 24th of June annually. The first is that the city itself describes a difference between procession and parade. Procession is something more related to the ritual, and the parade is something more related to the civic. Historically, when I tried to understand it, I looked at the history of feasts going back to Roman Republican feasts to find about where in the table itself, where in the calendar itself, this particular feast of 24th of June took place, and whether it had anything to do with those feasts. So I had to look at the festive history. I also created a timeline that linked political history, religious history, social history, art history. So there are vertical lines which relate to church councils and the exile of the popes. There are battles in the black dots running through the middle, dates of publications of books, and bits of buildings when doorways were put in to see if there was anything related to any of these conditions, to try and understand the more complex relationship between the politics, the critical cultural history, and the architecture and the festive life itself. We got here. So I also looked at the mapping. So this is a series of maps of the city itself. So the map seems to be a bit corrupted there. This is a map of the festival as it was in the 13th century, where I traced all of the different houses which related to, I had each of the little red dots is a house, which I had the name of the owner, and the civic buildings, and traced the paths of the festival, the processions around in relation to this, to understand the spatial and symbolic relationship between the foundation. Here's a painting from Matsuri from the 16th century, which relates in the background to the location of what they understood as the Roman city, with the act of Roman foundation going in the front with the auger, with the plough being pulled by a bull and a cow. So the relationship between the Civic foundation and the Roman foundation, and the way it was represented, both in the 16th century, as you've just seen, but here earlier in the 13th century, I think this was from, where we've got a bag of buildings. So the buildings aren't actually in the right position in relation to each other here, but they're held in by the city wall. So the sense that the order is not a perspectival order, but maybe the order of the city is structured in different ways was also critically important. The looking at different ways history is working. This is the path of the candle procession on the current in the current situation, and this is what it looks like, the parade in the morning. So I used photographs for the events, taking the flag holders, the drummers, and these are the people who organize the event itself, who break, in a sense, the fourth wall of the procession, talking to various people who want to become a part of the procession, briefly walking along and then breaking away again. There's no separation, no barriers, no luminous green jackets telling us what to do. And that there is this relationship between the civic and the religious order of the city, which plays out in a mass throughout that finishes off the morning set of feast. But one can walk up and participate in all of these spaces without an invite. But then we end up with an understanding of these thresholds that we can see that still work. So here we have, in a sense, almost the three different Turner-esque things: the incorporation in the foreground, the witnesses in the background, and the people in transition somewhere in the middle. There's this relationship that still continues. And then we also have the afternoon parade, which follows its way from up in Santa Maria Novella down to Santa Croce, the two mendicant orders of the city, and what that looked like at the front, where there is still some morning pomp and circumstance, but it took me one or two times to realize I had to look at the back as well, where the football teams parade through as a part of the procession through to the game, where the football is followed by the teams that aren't going to be performing on the day, and then ultimately their supporters, who have banter and chant with alongside the police, who have a very, it's a very open and inclusive atmosphere, albeit quite aggressively white male fighting, because that's a part of the inversion of this part of the day. At one point, the processions separate, so the supporters move into another part of the city, and the other procession continues. And the football match that we're talking that becomes a part of it, the Calcio Storico, had various different places over the course of its history throughout the city, but it has this nature of an inverted order, so that these people, these physical specimens who then spend a lot of time trying to hurt each other, become the heroes momentarily within an inverted civic hierarchy that for the earlier parts of the day and for later on in the day also have a re-establishment of the existing order. So the festival itself can hold disruption and order as a part of the same ordering structure overall. But what's really important is that this football match is held in the city and not in a football stadium. If it were held in a football stadium, it wouldn't have the same political order or the same civic representational order. And that's a really important part of an understanding of it, even back to the accounts of the 13th century from Vigliani, the architecture is not necessarily discussed, but one can see just by these two photographs that the relationship between seeing a football match within a different environment within the city, which we'll see again a bit later, is sorry, something's happened here. There we go. Is important. It works in the evening. Everyone goes into various parts of the city and engages in a different way to the civic order of the city, with again hierarchies, with restaurants and outside places to sit, all becoming a part of that structure. And so in order to understand a part of this, there's been very gloss through my research, photographs, mapping. Here talk about, we can look at the work that was done on a painting. So this is a painting, a wall painting in the Palazzo Vecchio, which is a representation of the civic order of the city, which in a sense is played out with the civic, with the mayor and the cardinal at the bottom, the people with the flags. But it still relates back to quotes from Cicero, quotes from various different important, significant people who've written on the city. This is Ghirlandaio image from the 15th century, and still played out on the streets. And so understanding the order of something like this within a place that continues to be used both as a place of tourism, but also a place for civic meetings is a significant part of the way the research works. And here you can see the end of the football match played out in front of the Palazzo dell'Antella, where we have an extraordinary perspectival facade that the windows vary in distance from each other in order to create from either end of the square an increased notion of its size, with Cosimo II de' Medici's statue there still overlooking the football events that go on today. So it's a very complicated hierarchy of events that has all of the parts that I just tried to describe right at the beginning. And I'm going to have to stop because I've probably gone over my time, but I just wanted to show you as an initial introduction to this, both these basic themes of experience and historicity, and how one begins to try to articulate those, trying to understand ideas of threshold and liminality, both in terms of space, time, but also experience. Thinking about the different levels of engagement one can have within a festival situation, the fact that often a festival situation has a reversal or a counterculture that comes along with it, but it resists total takeovers. Because of this counterculture, you can't completely control this environment. And even though architecture is often silent in many people's descriptions, it's central to the experience itself, through which tradition is consistently renewed within cities. And therefore the civic order, and this particular event in which the city presents itself back to itself, becomes modernized in this time out of time. So I'm going to stop sharing now, because that's I think what I was going to say, and I'll pass on to Matthew, who's going to then introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Christian. You are in fact ahead of time, so very well done. We can the 5 minutes or so we have saved, we can add to the end more time for questions. Just for clarification for members of the audience who might not be familiar, this Feast of San Giovanni in Florence and the games that go with it, is that an annual event that continues to this day?
Yes, it is. It started around about the 13th century, when the city itself becomes a civic representation, when the processional routes that are run by the church begin to get taken over by the city, and the Italian city-state is one of the first places in Europe where the city becomes civic and recognizes itself as a separate entity from the church, for example, linked but separate from it. It went through various periods of not going on and then going on. It has built up a history of events to do with when it's been taken over, and it's accumulated a set of histories over the period of the sort of 600 years since then. And then it was sporadically taken on board. But around 1930, Mussolini, who was trying to take back or reintroduce, take back Italian culture for the Italians. Art history was very much a sort of a Northern European gig, and he wanted to explore the idea that actually this was a much more lived experience for the Italians. And he, along with a whole series of tourist guides, started to, which were published at the time, to try to increase activity or interest in Italians with their own culture. He did things like this. So the Palio in Siena, the festivals in the tug of war in Pisa, there's a whole series, the jousting, there's a whole series of them that were reinvented at that time. But what's very interesting is that they're obviously historic before then, and Mussolini could not control them. And so in the same way that they were about Italian identity, the Italian identity was also partially anti-fascist. And so, you know, there was a and that's why they survived beyond as a sort of an annual event beyond Mussolini, because people realized that they were a significant way in which the city could represent itself to itself without necessarily adhering to one political view or another.
Great, thank you very much. Right, now we're going to go on to the second presentation, which comes from Jacek Ludwig-Skarso and Kirsten Thompson. Jacek is our colleague in the Research Center in Creative Arts, Cultures and Engagement. Jacek is a reader in art and performance and founder of Elastic Theatre. He is internationally recognized for his work that stretches the concepts of theatricality and public art, with projects that have most recently been presented in London, Hong Kong, and across Italy. Jacek leads a master's course in public art and performance at London Met, and he has held a teaching university fellowship. His honorary roles include that of public space advisor for city space architecture and collaborations with the Anis Gallery in London and Fondazione Marta Cioc in Rome. Jacek has been working with Kirsten Jessica Thompson, who is a graduate of the PhD program in architecture at London Met. She's an architect chartered in the UK and South Africa and design development director at an architectural practice in Kent. Following her professional training in South Africa, Kirsten completed a Master of Studies in Interdisciplinary Design for the Built Environment at the University of Cambridge, and her research there served as a springboard for her doctoral study, which was supervised by me, Maurice Mitchell, who's here today, and Professor Peter Carl, who I had coffee with yesterday and sends his regards. She also established her practice in Habitat as a vehicle for implementing intervention projects and undertaking research while in South Africa. Her London Met affiliation includes her work on the team Creature for the project that Jacek and Kirsten will talk about today, Artichoke, the role of maths gatherings in reclaiming spaces. So I'm going to hand over to Jacek. Do you want to share your screen and go ahead?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Matthew. I'm doing something that can be a bit annoying for if you're watching, and just need to share to find the right tab. Matthew, can you just confirm that you're seeing my PowerPoint now?
Yep, we can see it absolutely fine.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Matthew. Also, thank you very much to Christian for co-organizing this event, and to the IRF. Yes, so this presentation is co-presented by myself and by Kirsten Jeske-Thompson. So as Matthew's already introduced us, we'll go straight into the topic so we can make the most of the time that we have. So our presentation is called Safety in Numbers, Reclaiming Public Spaces Through the Work of Artichoke. And some of you will have seen that we gave this presentation in a slightly different format a couple of weeks ago as part of our research center Creature, Creative Arts, Cultures and Engagement. So in this particular session, we're going to present it in a more succinct way, and more specifically with some of the key emphasis that we're raising through this session, as Christian had announced before. Artichoke is a very well-known name, but I also am very aware that a lot of people will know of their works far more than perhaps the company as such. And so I'm just going to quickly identify, first of all, why we call this presentation Safety in Numbers, and why we chose Artichoke as a case study for this. So Safety in Numbers for us is a provocation. In the aftermath of COVID, safety in numbers is a paradoxical phrase through which we ponder on the future of mass events and their changing role in relation to public space. So there's definitely, even though our research is not only based on the aftermath of COVID, of course, COVID is particularly, it's given us lots of thought, lots of stimuli to think about. And why Artichoke? Well, I started to work with Artichoke last year, and we realized that there's plenty of scope for creating some research around their work, particularly because their work has been featured a lot on the general press, with lots of media exposure, but a little bit less in academic scholarship. So Artichoke is a leader in the production of ephemeral public art events that have redefined cities and their communities, and information taken from their website, founded in 2005 by Helen Marriage and Nikki Webb. The company's aim is to work with artists to create unique, large-scale experiences that appeal to the widest possible audience. I've got a show reel here that will give, and I hope that the sound will work. But you might hear the sound a little bit faint, but the sound is purely music, so it's purely atmospheric. This kind of gives you a little kind of overview of their work, and you probably recognize some projects that you were familiar with, but perhaps you didn't realize that they were produced by the same company. So here it goes. Brilliant. Oh. So it's very, as you can see, very powerful work. And our research started from some trigger questions that I'm going to quickly summarize here, although they're slightly more extensive in our work. What is the role of mass gatherings in reclaiming public spaces, particularly in light of the COVID pandemic? What strategies, both artistic and logistical, can we reflect upon in relation to Artichoke's work? So reimagining the public sphere post-COVID. I'm using a bit of a long quote here. This is from the report that Kirsten and I have co-written and is currently going through peer review to be published shortly, we hope. So as Andrew Hewitt and Mel Jordan observed, performativity is a useful frame to gauge our understanding of publicness, and we propose to reclaim this in the aftermath of COVID. The public is neither an empirical body nor a spatial concept. The public sphere is a performative arrangement. It is the activity of going public or making something public that fills particular places and spaces with public life. As we slowly emerge from the COVID pandemic, while the physical composition of public spaces will have remained largely the same, leaving us at times almost forgetting why we were restricted from them at all, their performative arrangements will have changed. The public slowly re-engages with such spaces, but new apprehensions affect this process as we implicitly interrogate the boundaries of our own comfort zone and that of others, with further complication derived by changing and often confusing public advice on safety measures. So this kind of gives you a sense of the how we've worked in terms of the report that Kirsten and I have put together. I'm not going to quote from this anymore because of time pressure, but there is an underpinning principle here that I'm going to leave Kirsten to talk about. Kirsten, are you there?
Thanks,
Oh,
Jacek. Yes, I've got sound now. Yes, the underpinning principles with the research into Artichoke's work was led by, and the research that we did into the work was led by case studies that we did, and the case studies were particularly chosen from a wide spread of Artichoke's work. So that we could get a view of the disruptors, and this word that we use as we interrogate the spaces that the ephemeral urbanism essentially takes, and how it transforms that space temporarily, hence ephemeral. And it allows the three different projects allow us to engage with the effects that each project has on the soft city, that is that citizenry that happens between the buildings and the spaces between, and how momentarily they're changed to allow us varied insights and alternative views on spaces that we perhaps inhabit each day consistently in a routine format. It just breaks it down in order to rebuild a new view of that space, that while it is temporary in its engaging of that space, there would be a lasting memory that is slightly altered of that space moving forward. Yeah, so I'm going to go into the case studies a bit more. So these, as I say, they were deliberate choice, these three case studies, the Sultan's Elephant, Lumiere and Processions. They had different zeitgeists, different spirits in the time. You can see 2006 to 2009, which is ongoing every 2 years, and then 2018. They followed different timelines. The Sultan's Elephant was a one-off, immediate, on the day interaction. intervention, really. Lumiere happens every 2 years, started in Durham, and now has come to London as well. And processions was a series of events that happened, from the engaging the education realm with children in primary school, taking part in activities, to making banners between groups of women, and embroidery sessions, to the production of a book, and then also an exhibition last year. So they all engaged the idea of disruption in a different way. So thank you, Jacek. So the data that we had, we separated, we used these case studies, we separated and compared. It's extensive data, quantitative and qualitative, but it also had the anecdotal references through interviews with Helen, and understanding the behind the scenes, and the behind the scenes of the organization that had to take place in order to make these events look as free and tangible as they do when you're in the space, with very limited distance between you and the exhibitions, between the audience and the exhibitions. And these case studies each have a different degree of that level of engaging, and they're different types. So besides the behind the scenes, it also allowed us to interrogate this idea of safety theatre, so that we could work through an understanding of personal limitations of people that are in the audience engaging these ephemeral disruptions, and to gauge an extent to which they were willing to actually engage these public art exhibitions. So in the Sultan's Elephant, in 2006, when social media was very limited by comparison to today, it was kept a secret. The whole exhibition was kept under lock and key at Battersea Power Station until the day that it was to engage the public. And so no one could really engage this public art display. They happened to be in the city. The circumstantial arrival at an event of this 2-story tall elephant moving down Pall Mall was a complete surprise. There was no press beforehand, there was no advertising, and there was no engaging prospective audience at all with the Sultan's Elephant. With Lumiere, and the other thing, sorry, with Sultan's Elephant is that it engaged disruption, this notion of disruption, breaking down in order to rebuild, as I was saying. In terms of the public space, it altered people's routines. Where they thought they could go, roads were closed, and new routes had to be found to navigate the city on that particular day, during that particular time in that space. Lumiere was an aesthetic disruption. You could navigate the city of an evening, or you do. It's ongoing. So it's light displays that are projected against buildings, inside buildings, against iconic components within the city, and it alters your sensory experience of the city in a darker space, using the city as gallery, essentially, as all these intervention projects, these ephemeral openness projects do. And it's altering the visual of the urbs, basically, so that the engaging from the audience is then altered, almost, as I say again, the next morning. If you engage the same space in the city, there is a lingering remembering that happens. The other thing with Lumiere, because it happens every 2 years, you can become it's automatically compared to itself every 2 years, and so there's new and fresh ideas, and how that is continuously disrupted over a period of time, Processions was even later in terms of closer to the today and our understanding of social media as we have it today, and advertising and marketing. And there was a stretch of marketing that was put out towards prospective audience to gather that following towards the actual event on the day, which was this march through the streets, and drew people into not only disrupting the space, but also a kinetic exhibition, if you like, as it moved through the streets of the city. That's yeah. It's over to you, Jasper. I think you're on silent, Jasper.
You're on mute, Jacek.
Sorry about this. Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes. We can hear you now, yeah.
Oh no, I'll have to do the same thing. I'll do it really quickly. So sorry. I don't know how that happened. Right, let me just go back to...
There we go.
Brilliant. Okay, good. I think it automatically muted me. I don't know why. But yes, so emerging findings from this research. These are just the last couple of slides. So just to sum up some of the initial findings, and in a second I'll also make the point that this is an ongoing research that we are continuing in the next, and we hope to continue in the next couple of next year or even more. But for now, looking back at Artichoke's work, we've kind of traced some key patterns in their work that relate very well to the topics that we're talking about today. There is an inherent adaptability of the work, which highlights metaphorically the idea of sort of urban resilience. The work is always different, and I should say, just to clarify, that Artichoke commissions, produces, facilitates work that of course involves hundreds of different artists, companies, etc. So they are not the sole makers of work, they're in fact more enablers of different creative efforts. There is a balancing of participation with artist-led expertise, and this is something we talk about in our report, because participation has become, as much as it is a very relevant topic, but it's also one that sometimes gets mentioned almost by default. And there is Helen Marriage, the director of Artichokes, mentions this point that we need to preserve also the idea that there is an expertise that comes from artists that shouldn't simply be confused as authoritarian simply because there is an idea that's sort of initiated by some to enable participation as well. So this idea of participation in artist-led expertise is another pattern. And then finally, this idea of the ephemeral creative disruption. So as you see, we use this term disruption a lot to really, to some extent, it kind of reminds me a bit from Christian's previous overview, the idea of the liminoid when it comes to Turner, and the idea of the liminal, the liminoid. So it's a disruption that is creative, but ultimately it's ephemeral in order to reimagine the space. And in that sense, we see it as an urbanist intervention, even though it's ephemeral and absolutely going back to that point of the soft city that, of course, connects with Christian's point on the civitas. Finally, where next with this research? I should say, first of all, that we've got in the audience Dr. Anna Kim, who's also is going to be particularly in the next phase, going to be particularly involved in this research, and we look forward to that. For now, what we're doing is that we're publishing our existing findings through this report that Kirsten and I have co-authored, through further funding, and we keep our fingers crossed because we're just at the last round of a funding bid to allow us to do this. So through further funding, we want to focus the work on the present. So right now, as you see, we're looking at the past productions to look for threads. Now we're thinking on the present. So the creation of new research tools, including a digital resource, part archive, part map, to be used in concurrent and future projects. So that's very much the idea that we want to see. And we're particularly interested in the idea of how do you capture the cultural value in the sense of lived experience of participants and spectators. And finally, sharing the above tools with peer organizations, both peer organizations and public institutions, in order to promote effective practice and, where needed, policy changes, because we should say that actually the work of Artichoke and the incredible reach that it's had has also been instrumental in very much shaping and informing new policies, particularly when it comes to the Arts Council of England. So we look forward to be part of that movement. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing, and sorry about the glitch before.
Thank you, Jacek. Thank you, Kirsten. That was great. So just a quick follow-up, just for clarification. You talked about the qualitative and quantitative modes of accounting for the events, the kind of data collection, if you like. In terms of capturing the events themselves, the events that you were talking about were all in the past. Is that correct, or did you actually?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, right. But you're looking forwards to recording
absolutely
ongoing events.
Exactly. That's definitely the next stage.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. We will come back, obviously, to questions afterwards. Now we're going to talk to Ray Lucas. Ray is a friend and colleague of us in the school. Ray is reader in architecture at Manchester School of Architecture, where he is head of humanities, working across undergraduate and postgraduate programs. Ray has a PhD in social anthropology, proposing a theory of notation as a thinking tool, and an MPhil in architecture with the thesis Filming Architecture. His books, which together map a primary interest in anthropological aspects of architecture, include Research Methods for Architecture, which is, of course, a textbook for many of our students and some in the audience here today. Also, Drawing Parallels, Knowledge Production in Axonometric, Isometric, and Oblique Drawings, and Anthropology for Architects, Social Relations and the Built Environment. Ray's next book is an architectural anthropology of Japanese festivals for Bloomsbury, and this is what he will be talking about primarily today. Thank you very much for joining us, Ray. Over to you.
Thanks. All right. Let's get these slides up. Does that look okay?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Right. So, apologies if I race through this a little bit. It's culled from a much longer presentation that I tend to split over 2 hours for students at Manchester. But I suppose that the driver behind tonight's talk is really to position these Japanese festivals as architectural in nature, and to really explore what that means, to think about how these allow us to think about architecture differently, and also, you know, what it is that they bring to this broader discussion of the built environment. So the Matsuri in question are, you know, that's the general term for a Japanese festival, and I'm going to be speaking about 2 of these: the Gion Matsuri in Kyoto, and the Sanja Matsuri in Tokyo. And this is a very rough and ready timeline, just to give an idea of the way that this has been celebrated. You know, the persistence of this particular celebration, the Gion Matsuri, founded in 869 after a serious plague hit the city of Kyoto. And therefore it has its origins as a purification rite, and begins to develop into a placation of the gods which are housed at the Asakusa Shrine in Kyoto. And it is initially held only when there is another outbreak, until around the year 1000, when it becomes an annual event. And there are a number of pauses due to the feudal nature of Japan, but it's deliberately revived by the daimyo Oda. The date's a little wrong here, so around 1580 or so. And it then gains most of its current form during the Tokugawa shogunate, where there was a period of peace and therefore of great wealth generation by merchants. And it's a very mercantile driven event, particularly to do with the merchants in the kimono industry. So that's kind of the peak of the event. And obviously it is then held regularly with some breaks from time to time until 2019. And it remains to be seen if it will return this year. This event is held in July over the course of the month with several different events. Sanja Matsuri is a similarly long history to it, and represents a kind of founding myth for Tokyo itself. So in 628, the fishing village on the banks of the Sumida River, long before Tokyo was established as we find it now, 3 residents of the village out fishing find an idol of the Buddhist goddess of mercy, the Kannon, and they found the major temple of Sensoji in Asakusa, which is kind of one of the starting points for the city. And this again goes through a number of variations before being established around 1312 in the form that we understand it now, as these 3 individuals become elevated to godhood or spirithood and are celebrated as the founders of Asakusa in particular. And again, related to the Tokugawa shogunate, 1649, the Asakusa Shrine itself is constructed. The temple at Sensoji shares its sacred precinct with the Shinto shrine of Asakusa Jinja, and these are the temple is destroyed in 1945 during the firebombing of Tokyo, and is rebuilt in the 1960s. And again, this is an annual festival with a number of breaks, depending on various disasters and other world events, but largely an annual event. And I suppose part of the position that I take with this work is really to think about festival as hyperordinary, as superordinary, rather than as exceptional, as spectacle, and taking a cue from Lefebvre, looking at these festivals in the French countryside, where he talks about how they contrasted from everyday life but were not separate from it. And then Victor Turner and Arnold van Gennep, who've been mentioned already, this notion of subjunctivity that comes up in Turner's account here. That for a while almost anything goes, taboos are lifted, fantasies enacted, indicative mood behaviour is reversed, the low are exalted and the mighty abased. But there remain some rules as well, and ritual forms constrain the order, importantly. But the approach that I take has some origins in the work of Konwajiro, the architect working around the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923, who went on to document everyday life in Tokyo under his adopted terminology of a modernology, simply bearing witness to what he saw. Nothing was too banal or uninteresting for him to look at. And this engages with my work with Tim Ingold, where in 2013 he writes about alternative forms of anthropology that don't rely on ethnography. And he proposes an anthropography, but I much prefer the term graphic anthropology. That's something that I've certainly adopted in my work. And that's where I position the approach that I've taken of multiple forms of representation, each allowing one to dwell a little longer with the moments grasped in 7 or 8 years of visits to various festivals in Japan. So I suppose that some of the things that got cut were the in situ research, which goes beyond the photography of the construction that goes around the festival, the building of these portable shrines, these mikoshi, miniaturized buildings designed to house the kami. Over 100 of these are mobilized in Sanja Matsuri over the course of the 3 days that it takes place. So there's photography, there's filmmaking, there's also audio recording and various then editing of those to begin to understand the complexity and layered nature of how this district of Tokyo comes to life during this period. So there are appropriations of space, people taking command of and being present within the city. There are formal processions where the city represents itself. We see the heron-hooded dancers here who represent one part of the fishing tradition where fishermen would train birds to fish alongside them. The erection of temporary buildings all across this large district as stages, as places for the neighbourhood association to gather. And the boisterous nature of the carrying of these mikoshi, heavy timber, lacquered and gilded, decorated with heavy ropes and bells, and with a spirit installed into it, rocked about from side to side and carried around the city to entertain and placate the spirit over the course of the festival. So there are various routes and various elements within this, all organized at a relatively local level. This idea of the neighborhood association, where people are automatically enrolled into that simply by being a resident, and they then organize a very, very localized part of the celebration, with the larger version organized from the main shrine. But there's layers of appropriation and taking over the space, of being present, of simply having street parties, of flooding onto the streets and so on. So part of my approach has really been to draw my way around this, to use that evidence to produce large series of drawings, which I'm only showing a fraction of here, in order to understand them as spatial phenomena, in order to understand the ways in which they are a form of material culture, which is both traditional and contemporary. The use of ad hoc materials, the cheapest materials possible, and also the many variations of these mikoshi, and how they are carried by a large pack of individuals, each of whom has a particular role, and with a number of people behind who are circulating in and out as people get exhausted, sometimes described as a kind of extreme sport. So there are these layers of community engagement, these neighbourhood association headquarters where money is taken in for the upkeep of the festival, where the celebration is centred, and which is left closed outside of those periods. But the identification of people with particular districts according to the form of dress that they wear during the festival, the happy coat, which tells us which of the local neighbourhood any individual belongs to, or if you've got another status such as the geisha or the priest here, you will dress according to that. And there's this collapse of society where we see even the likes of the Yakuza gangsters who come out and show off their tattoos, brazenly in front of the police, in what is quite a rare display, and is part of that reversal that Turner talks about. So there are these layers of food and smells, and the notion of conducting sensory audits, looking at each of the different registers in which we're experiencing the space, thinking about the legitimate and the illegitimate, the use of the police and the fire service to not to corral, but simply to maintain some edges to the festival. And the various maps that one has of the 3 days of this festival, the initial procession, the large numbers coming in and centering on the main shrine, and then the 3 major mikoshi that belong to Asakusa Shrine, making their separate ways around and defining the territory, defining what they consider to be Asakusa. And these routes change year on year. But one of the things that comes up again and again is embodiment and the idea of the physicality of this event, and trying to describe this, first of all, through some pictorial notations, these little cartoonish drawings, then thinking about the weight and how that's distributed, and then finally, you know, through understanding the various elements that go into making the mikoshi, analysing using quite complex dance notation, Laban dance notation, trying to use that as an analytical tool to understand the various roles and individuals who are involved in the production of this particular festival. So these are some of the forms of interrogation that are still ongoing, that I'm still working through for Sanja Matsuri and also Gion Matsuri, which has a much wider spread in terms of how it engages with the city. It relies on a level of infrastructure to support the construction of these 27-meter tall hoko halberd floats, which are built from a kit of parts on the street and then raised up to their full height. And similarly, looking again at the costume, the way that people hold themselves, the way that they occupy the street, and the way that the street is occupied by the festival, with the Machiya townhouses opening up at certain points as the city becomes a museum, showing off the treasures of these wealthy families. So there are elements of this which are simply celebratory and engaging with the festival, but also understanding that these reinforce and sediment existing power structures at the same time. So I suppose we end with a proposition by way of Vitruvius and Van Gennep. You know, the Vitruvian triad that we have here, simply translating that into the festivals gives us a form of temporal durability, where these things have had hundreds of years of repetition, you know, embedding themselves into the social structure to the extent where, you know, Japanese respondents have been very confused as to why I would look at something like this. The social utility of reinforcing the bonds within these neighborhoods and city districts. And finally, the notion of the aesthetics and the beauty actually coming from the physicality that's engaged, the embodied nature of this. And I think that's, you know, that's kind of where we can start to push this into a fairly distinctly architectural mode. And, you know, back to Van Gennep, you know, that separation, transition, and incorporation, that these exist within this extended liminal state that happens during these and other festivals. So apologies for going over ever so slightly, I think, but I think that's me for now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray. That was absolutely perfect in terms of timing. Really interesting, and of course the drawings that we always like to see. Very beautiful. Great. Now, I am not going to make any remarks right away, because we're very lucky to be joined today by Claire Mel-Hewish as our discussant for this evening's event. Claire joins us from University College London Urban Laboratory, or the Urban Lab, as some of you will know it. The Urban Lab is a centre for cross and transdisciplinary urban research, teaching and engagement. Claire leads at the Urban Lab, the Urban Heritage Research Priority Area, and she co-leads Curating the City, which is a research cluster at the Center for Critical Heritage Studies. And that is a collaboration between UCL and the University of Gothenburg. Claire's research focuses on urban and anthropological analysis of large-scale urban developments and conceptualizations of urban heritage with transformative processes in multicultural cities. Claire has a long history of working at the intersection of anthropology and architecture, and her recent publications include Post-War Architecture Between Italy and the UK, Exchanges and Transcultural Influences, which is came out via UCL Press, co-edited with Lorenzo Ciccarelli, and Transforming Doha, Candide Journal for Architectural Knowledge number 12, which came out last year as well. So I'm going to invite Claire to respond to what we've been looking at. Claire, you can take as long as you like. We're ahead of schedule.
Oh gosh, that's a bit of a challenge. But I have got an awful lot of notes, and those were 3 really rich and very enjoyable presentations, especially for somebody who's had a very long-standing interest in the relationship between architecture and anthropology, as I have. In fact, it's almost embarrassing to admit that my architectural design issue, special profile, I can't remember what they're called, on architecture and anthropology was published in 1996, which seems almost archaic. So it's really nice to see some kind of more recent research in this field. I suppose just a quick word about Urban Lab. I mean, in case anybody isn't familiar with us, which is quite possible, but we are a space at UCL for cross-disciplinary urban research. We tend to use the terms cross-disciplinary and transdisciplinary rather than interdisciplinary, and I'm not quite sure why, but maybe that's something that we can again discuss, open up to the audience. But I think one of the points is that we're very, but with reference to the term transdisciplinary, we're very keen to translate our research from the academic sphere into the public sphere. And these questions about the way that we understand cities as both physical and social infrastructures, or if you like, hardware and software, are really key to what Urban Lab's been doing since 2005, when it was set up by Matthew Gandhi, who was a geographer. Matthew was succeeded by Ben Campkin, who's an architectural historian who you may well know, and then I've been director since 2018, and I do come from a background in social anthropology and architectural history. And I think one of the other things to mention is our sort of forthcoming move to UCL East and the new campus there that UCL has been developing, which again has been very much conceived as a space for cross-disciplinary and transdisciplinary activity, with a focus on performance and media as a field of academic research, and a sphere of collaboration between academics and local partners, local organizations in different areas, including particularly urbanism. So again, this conversation is very sort of pertinent to some of the things that we've been focusing on, particularly in the development of our new program, the MASC Global Urbanism, which will open up there. But so coming back to focus a bit on the relationship between architecture and anthropology, and perhaps some of the questions that these presentations bring forward in particular. I think that, obviously this is a really timely moment for thinking about these, not least because it is carnival time, and not here, but elsewhere in the world, the beginning of Lent. And so it's a great time to be thinking about the use of the city as public space in different cultures and different traditions. But also because obviously, as we're all very much aware, we are kind of emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic, which has raised all sorts of vital questions about the way that bodies interact in public space, in cities. And Kirsten and Jacek's presentation clearly spoke to that. In particular, we've had to really think about what the city means for us if we can't interact in the city as a body of people, civitas, the soft city. If the city just becomes a sort of set of buildings and spaces empty of social interaction. A lot of people left the city during this time because they couldn't any longer see the point of being in the city, and that is quite a sort of that's quite a sobering phenomenon to consider. And although people are beginning to return to the city, I think it still raises a lot of questions about how we deal with, or have dealt with historically, the impact of infectious disease at different times, and what that means again for this idea of the city as civitas, as a set of public spaces for different kinds of formal and informal social interactions. And what does it mean also, something we've been considering through our Urban Lab theme of emergency, in relation to the kinds of measures that have been imposed by different urban authorities in different cities throughout the world, which have varied a lot in their extent and nature, and the sort of the severity with which they've been imposed. And I think that kind of links quite interestingly also to the idea of the city as theatre, and thinking about the practice of architecture and urban design. I think, the city, urban design has kind of engaged with the city as a theatre, as a stage for public life. Historically, especially if we think going back to Renaissance times, the very idea of Venice as a set of different scenarios for the tragic, the comic, and the satiric. So different sorts of definitions of public life, some given more prominence than others. And so what does that kind of tradition of thinking about urban design as a form of theatrical design or stage design mean for us now, again, in these sort of new kinds of times that we're living in, and also in relation to the sort of emergence of cities on a global stage within a sort of international network of cities, engaging with the idea of urban identity in rather a different form, perhaps, than they have historically. So then I just wanted to kind of think, sorry, I will come to some questions, but just trying to work through some of these issues. I think, coming back to the question of public space, and I have, personally done research in the Gulf, where public space really doesn't have at all the meaning that it has for us here. So thinking of public secular space as a distinctively Western phenomenon, one that's intrinsically linked to values of democracy and popular representation, again, is something I think we have to kind of approach. We can't just take it for granted. We have to kind of approach it critically. And certainly in a city like Doha, or some of the cities that I've visited and worked in Iran, public space just isn't used in the same way. It's only used for religious purposes or family orientated activities. But I think there is some kind of interesting commonality between the religious use of, say, Islamic cities and Christian cities in terms of, the phenomena like religious processions. But again, yeah, I think that we do have to think about the way that we use public space quite critically, and what it means for, the mingling of bodies, where, in some cultures, gender segregation is the absolute norm, and really changes the nature of the way that those public spaces are used. and also linking to, you know, the sort of topic of disorder that's been touched on by Christian, perhaps in all the presentations, as a kind of fundamental aspect of some of these, you know, carnivalesque uses of European or westernized cities that just doesn't necessarily have the same significance in other contexts. And I suppose this again very much links to the thinking about how cities represent themselves, and, you know, going back to this idea of urban identity. So, you know, how has that changed over the centuries, and where are we now, if you like, in terms of re-examining that idea of urban representation in the global world that we live in. And so I think that kind of takes me to my kind of key question, which is, why are these questions relevant, or how are they relevant to the sorts of contemporary urban challenges that we face, aside from the pandemic, which is obviously one very big one. But I suppose I've been, you know, a lot of my work has also dealt with the idea of the post-colonial city in different contexts. And I was quite struck by the fact that Ray and Christian's presentations are very much focused on context of real, still very cohesive kind of cultural and religious integrity. But in a city like London, again, where I do a lot of my work, you know, obviously that isn't the case. We live in a very fragmented city where public space is invested with a particular kind of political and symbolic significance, but actually many people in this city don't have a lot of access to public space, certainly in the centre of the city, or don't necessarily feel that they have that access, and don't feel that they belong to the city in that way. And that's very much because we are a post-colonial city. We're a city that has been fundamentally shaped and reshaped by different flows of migration. And we know that we're also a very unequal city, and that is partly characterized by an inequality of access to urban space. So in a context of multiculturalism, post-colonialism, whatever you like to call it, you know, very diverse heritage and heritage traditions and cultural value systems, how do we go about engaging with this kind of anthropologically shaped approach to understanding public space? And I think what struck me, you know, seeing Jacek and Kristen's presentation was, you know, this question of, do we now need to curate that public space because we simply don't have that cohesiveness in these, you know, big cities, big global cities like London, very different in some ways from Florence, for example, or even perhaps Tokyo. Yeah, so the work of organizations like Artichoke, I think, is really interesting, because is it stepping into a kind of void that has been created by this, not necessarily breakdown of cultural cohesiveness, but a kind of fragmentation of cultural values, and also a lack of recognition of different types of cultural values within the city and the way in which the city represents itself. So I think somebody mentioned this idea of filling public spaces with public life. Is that something that we now sort of have to actively do and catalyze, because it doesn't happen in the same way that it used to, and still does in these kind of smaller, for example, Italian historic cities? This idea of ephemeral urbanism, is that again something that we have to generate to fill a void? And is it participation in the way that I did frame it, or is it more like urban marketing, because cities now, you know, are vying for a position in this global network of cities and this economy of images that is often talked about. So I think maybe that's where I should open it up and invite responses from you all. Yeah, and perhaps lead into a question that focuses a bit more on the methods that we use to understand these processes as well.
Thank you for that, Claire. I think I'd like to ask each of the speakers to respond in turn, really to that overarching question of how are these questions that have been raised through these presentations and your very generous reflections there, how do they become relevant to the current situation, which you described in relation to fragmentation, but of course these different contexts that the speakers have spoken about are different in themselves. So I'd like to go to Christian first. Christian, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, there's a lot. There was a lot in there. I think in the question, but I think one of the things that I'm my own research was trying to understand was the idea of renewal. That the tradition itself is hard won. It's not something that you inherit and don't change. It's something that the representation within the city, whatever the identity of that city has been, is taken by the next generation. I mean, I could talk about the various historical phases and how inclusive they were to various different aspects of the community. But I think what's really interesting, and I was reflecting on this via Ray's talk, was that albeit there's a danger that one sees these things as being potentially quite introverted in relation to the individual cities, which is sort of an implied part of the question. But in fact, what I in doing the research, what I felt was that someone from Japan would recognize the civic representation of the festival in Florence, and I think someone in Florence would recognize the civic representation of the ones that Ray was talking about. And so I think there's something that goes beyond knowledge in terms of the understanding of the depth of this. And I think as academics we're talking about knowledge, but actually what I was trying to do in my research and was to try to understand the nature of the experience itself rather than the particularity of each particular experience. So trying to get to the ontological nature of festival and why that in relation to a city is a critical relationship worth looking at. And in that sense, I don't think that the findings or the work that I came out with is necessarily so unapplicable to what you've called multicultural cities, because I think all European cities are multicultural to a degree. Whether the representation of them is as obviously multicultural or needs to be multicultural is a question I think at the heart of my own interest. And the one of the things I'm just going to finish on is the idea of community. One of the critiques of Victor Turner relates to the idea of he talks about festivals rather than describes them. There's a way in which the community, albeit the people who criticize him, say that if one constantly looks for competing discourses within the city, if one's constantly looking for identity, the danger is only increase of individuality or identity. Whereas there is another arc of research which, even if we can argue that 95% of the experience within the city is related to identity and difference, actually I'm interested in the 5% that's actually about community. And whilst that might be a little idealist, I think that's probably where I would say some of this work sits.
Thanks for that, Christian. I'm going to go over to Jacek, and Jacek, if Kirsten wants to add something after you, that would be great. But let's keep it quite brief so that we can get time also for the audience to speak.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you, Claire, for these really interesting reflections. And it's really interesting to see connections and contrasts in between the different topics. You raise a really important point that there's, on the one level, one could see kind of by default the work by, for instance, Artichoke as being as representative of a city like London that's post-colonial, that's multicultural. But you also raise a very important point that we can easily fall into the trap of this sort of economy. I was thinking of the experience economy, to use another term that's so relevant in that sense. You know, that we kind of end up kind of confusing the public space, the truly democratic kind of inclusive public space, with simply the spectacle of that through which, you know, kind of the space is sold as public, if that makes sense. And I think you're absolutely right to raise the point. And we discuss it with Artichoke, and I should say actually Artichoke is a very interesting example because all their work is always free to the public. And so and in that sense, I always want to really make, for instance, in the report, we really make that distinction between the work produced by Artichoke in that sense, and let's say the type of festivals that you might see around that can be absolutely equally valid, but have a very often a type of economy that can be quite prohibitive for much of the audience. Interesting also the word, I often use the word spectacle, and I like to reclaim the power of spectacle, coming myself from a theatre background to begin with, that there's something for me that's very powerful in the word spectacle, but I'm also very, very super conscious of the other connotation. Spectacle, the one that always comes to mind is the Society of the Spectacle by Debord, where again there is an implication of spectacle as transaction, as something that is artificial, that we are sold, you know. So just to finish on that point, I think that's what we're trying to do in this research with Artichoke, is to really keep these questions always dynamic, never simply kind of sit complacent in the knowledge that something that is by default, you know, very inclusive, very spectacular, very entertaining, is necessarily always very democratic and in that sense public space as it's meant to be. And I completely agree also that this idea of public space is always, you know, there's always that sort of kind of blurred idea. You know, lots of shopping centers are effectively public spaces, but are they really? You know, sometimes you see some wonderful public art pieces in big shopping centers, but of course the nature of them, even though the public is allowed in, but there is an implication also of who's really got access to it. Kirsten, did you want to add something?
Just one or two points from Claire's comments about perhaps Artichoke is and this ephemeral urbanism is filling a gap that is a need, essentially. I think through our research we realized that if you follow a timeline like we did, that there is possibly an ebb and a flow of engagement with and outside of the city, so in and out, so levels of engagement. And I think what happens after something like a pandemic, or as we went further back to 2006 with Sultan's Elephant, is that Sultan's Elephant happened just after the 7/7 bombings, and it's about reclaiming that confidence to have the city as your the city as gallery, or your city as the play space, and so that it's not just that civic routine that's contained by the rigidity of the urbs. It's bringing the civic back to play. And that might go, you know, these events will come and go, and I don't think we're past any of them yet, and they will continue through. History repeats itself, as they say. So I think it's about responding to calling people back and reclaiming their confidence and reclaiming that city space.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. And now I'm going to hand over to Ray. I'm just going to say to members of the audience, we're not really going to have much time for extended questions, but if you have something to say, do put your hand up and I will collect any final comments after Ray has spoken before handing back to Claire for the last word. Okay, so over to you, Ray.
Thanks. I suppose that the topic I'd like to pick up from Claire was that notion of public space, particularly when looking at Japanese cities. They're not cities with a great deal of public space in the sense that we understand it, you know, for example, in the Italian city, where there is explicitly a square, where there, you know, there is that public realm in the way that the theory often addresses it. So the public space is created during the festival, by the festival, through the activities of people, and then it becomes privatized again. And these are, you know, narrow back streets. There are, you know, there are avenues constrained by a lot of building. The public spaces of the parks aren't used actually in these festivals. They're not a big part of it. So there's an engagement with the everyday spaces and a transfiguration of those, which I think is really interesting. That, you know, the Mikoshi is taken through shopping arcades. It is parked in the lobby of a hotel. It, you know, when it's not in use, it is stored as a museum object in a subway station. You know, there's all these odd categories of public and private space that I think are really interesting. But some of that neighborhood organization comes from the move in the early 20th century from rural populations to urban, where they tried to replicate the idea of the village by enrolling people into these neighborhood associations. So there are some of these structures which have got alternative histories about movements from rural to urban environments and so on. So I think there's a lot of intersecting narratives around these, but simply to start thinking about them as architectural, I think, is really important, and to look at the temporary architecture, the mobile architecture, the appropriations and transformations, the decorations and the memory that persists from year to year. That, you know, these events with those modifications from one year to another, you know, they do reinforce existing power structures. So they're not innocent events by any stretch, but there is an architectural importance to thinking about these that I think is where I would like to take my own research in this, is almost a retroactive manifesto, like Rem Koolhaas, and to think what would that look like when you apply it to this particular genre of festivals.
Thanks, Ray. Yeah, no, it's really interesting to come back to those questions of spatiality, and I think all of us, notwithstanding talking a lot about the events themselves, have talked quite a lot about the function and character of the spaces, and I think that your idea of how the participation of the city is also not just through the kind of architecture as a silent but implicated background, but also as a completely transformed setting. So in a sense, the spaces, the permanence of the city spaces is not just something you take for granted, but that is a medium for transformation. So really interesting differences and similarities across the talks. I'm going to invite Claire to make any final comments if she wishes to do so, after which I'll just say some thank yous and hand back to Svetlana to close. Claire, do you have any further thoughts or reactions?
Sorry, just trying to unmute. No, I don't really want to take up too much more time, other than just to say that I think this is a range of really interesting work that makes a valuable contribution to this question of the the intersection between architecture and anthropology. And I think we're all aware that there has been historically, and continues to be to a great extent, a lack of engagement between architects and anthropologists. Anthropologists ignore the architecture. Architects and urban designers sort of tend to ignore the people a bit. So trying to bring those two things together is a continuing endeavor. And I think in the range of methods that you've touched upon, it sort of highlights yeah, a number of different approaches to this. The one thing I would say, just to finally conclude, that I did find quite interesting was that nobody mentioned participant observation in these research processes, which of course it lies at the absolute core of anthropology. So perhaps if we just sort of set that in there alongside those other very interesting methods that were spoken of, we'll be really making some progress.
Thank you very much, Claire. So it just falls to me to thank everybody for your attendance. Thank you to the audience. I see we've had a comment from Joanna Torkins, who says, "Thank you for the session. Before austerity and COVID, I used to organize public festivals and even interviewed once for a job at Artichoke. It's been a nice chance to reflect." I would like to also thank Svetlana and Gary from the Interdisciplinary Research Forum for inviting us to set up this event, to Anna Kamek from the Research and Postgraduate Office for your coordination, and of course to Daria Buhanovska, one of our PhD students, who is going to write it up afterwards and share it in the newsletter. So I'm going to just return now to Svetlana to close. Thanks all for coming.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody, for making time to participate in this wonderful event, and of course to our presenters for fascinating presentations. I've learned a new word, transdisciplinarity, and maybe this is where we will move soon. If I may just say a couple of words, you know, it's I think maybe I could add some kind of sociological perspective as well, because it seems to me that talking about performances and political events, political rituals, maybe we could also look at Jeffrey Alexander and his development of Durkheim's ideas about festivals as combining cognitive and emotional impact on the participants. So, or maybe even look at Steve Lukes with his idea of the political meanings of festivals. But anyhow, we will continue this, I'm sure, in our next events in our forum. And for now, I just want to thank everyone and hope that you will join us again for future events in our program. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.